But welcome everyone, and we are going to be talking with Matt Sleat about his new book, Post-Liberalism. So it has appeared in the UK, but has not. Sorry, can't quite see it, but it's not yet available in the US. I thought the release was February 9th, but Amazon is posting it as February 24th. So if you're in the US, you might have to wait a little while before you can pick it up. But before we get started, and I'll ask Matt a few questions about the book's main themes, since I'm assuming that probably no one has been able to read it in advance. So we'll spend maybe 15 minutes or so just introducing the main themes and claims of the book, and then open it up for audience Q&A. But before we do that, I thought we could just quickly go around and introduce ourselves. So just say your name and where you're calling from. That's actually useful information for Matt. And then also what your interests are in the topic of post-liberalism, or if you're just curious and you don't really know anything about it, that's fine. So I will start and then we'll end with Matt. My name's Adam. And I'm a political philosopher by training. I've been interested in varieties of post-liberalism for a few years, specifically the forms that Matt engages with in his book. So I wanted to talk with him about it and thought it would resonate with Inter-Intellect members, and luckily it did. So pleased to be here. And okay, so Ines, if you could just briefly introduce yourself. Oh, you're muted.
Always happens. I am joining from Barcelona, Spain, and my interest in the topic lies in, well, there's a variety of related phenomena that I'm interested in, particularly demographics and human biodiversity, and the relationship between these two levels of resolution and political systems. I suppose that would be what interests me more. But the question of equality is also one that I've grappled with without any resolution. So um, that's why I'm here.
All right, thank you. And Zambor, my apologies if I mispronounce your name.
No worries at all. Jean-Bor, I'm tuning in from New York City. I think I'm most interested in positive outlooks or utopia.
Great, thank you. Victoria?
Hi there. My name is Victoria. I'm from the Twin City area of Minnesota, and my interest in liberalism, it's just a very current topic right now. I just recently read Cass Sunstein's book on liberalism, and so that was a very interesting, real big tent perspective on the topic. So I'm interested to hear about this as well, and also just like that tension between the individual and if you want to be very broad, you say society, but I'm actually looking at more specific groups. You know, once you group people, where's the tension between individual rights and obligations and rights and obligations of a group and to the group? So that's me.
Thank you. Adrian?
Hi there, Adrian Legrand. I'm zooming in from the UK. I've been interested in these debates around post-liberalism for a few years now, and I guess in particular, I'm interested in the relationship between the debates around post-liberalism and some of the literature of the defense of a perceived crisis of liberalism. I think we had Francis Fukuyama talking about his book Liberalism and Its Discontents uh, a month or so ago. So I think that there are these two genres, and I'm interested in the relationship between those two.
Okay, thank you. And if you want to opt out, that's fine. I'll just give you a few seconds, and if you don't say anything, I'll just assume that you're. But John, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. So John Muller, a retired lawyer, so just really curious about the topic. Um, read Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed several years ago now, and just interested to see kind of what new thoughts there might be on the subject. So that's about it.
Thank you. And Chien?
Hi, I'm calling in from Toronto. Just like John, I read Deneen's works. Actually, we were in a book club recently. We read both Why Liberalism Failed and Regime Change. And actually, before reading Deneen, I would consider myself a follower of another maybe post-liberal thinker, Alistair McIntyre. And so I'm quite interested to see, what the group's thoughts are on this like general shift. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Trey, I don't know if you wanted to stay muted or go ahead.
I'm from Colin from Alabama, and I'm interested in this in trying to predict or at least anticipate possible directions the Republican Party or the right or MAGA or however you want to define it may go, or any group as it relates to more immediate or midterm, like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years for the politics in the US.
Okay, thank you. And okay, so someone just dropped out. I guess, is that everyone? I think it is. There's Laura's note taker, but I will ignore that. So Matt, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and then we'll get started. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, first of all, let me just say thank you for the invitation to join you. I really do appreciate the invitation and the interest in the book. I am a professor of political theory at the University of Sheffield in the UK, although I do live in London. And I was saying to Adam just before this started that one of the reasons I'm sort of doubly glad to be joining you all is because the book is coming. I think it is coming out tomorrow. Amazon seems to have a delay in its release date. At least that was the case in the UK. But the book became sort of not intentionally as I started the project, but very much about American political thinkers like Deneen, as has already been mentioned, and Adrian Vermeule. So it became very much about American thinkers, and in a sense, much more about American politics, the future American right. So I really am interested in how these ideas and my thoughts in the book are going to land on your side of the pond.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, we are just finishing up introductions. If you wish, you can opt out, but would you like to just say where you're calling from and what your interest is in the salon?
Yeah, I'm calling from Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, and I'm really just interested in I feel like politically post-liberal thinking is ascendant, but I think day to day liberalism still feels kind of alive and well for the most part, and I'm really interested in is this political trend sort of something that's basically kind of the future of where we're heading. So.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask Matt a couple of questions just to introduce the book's main themes, and then we can go to audience Q&A after 10 or 15 minutes or so. So Matt, just the first question I have is, what do you mean by post-liberalism? So some people use post-liberalism and the new right as synonyms, maybe neo-reaction as well. But you mean something fairly specific. So you're excluding people like Curtis Yarvin and radical monarchy from post-liberalism. You're not talking about national conservatism. Could you just talk a bit about the common good strand of post-liberalism that the book focuses on and why you chose to focus on that?
Yeah, it's right. In part, my reason for wanting to focus on post-liberalism was because I saw the problem that it was being used too often by the Commentariat as a sort of catch-all term or synonym for the new right. And I thought that was a mistake, because I thought it sort of then obscured that group who actually call themselves post-liberal, and who I do think have a very unique, discrete position within the new right. And I should say whose influence on American politics and therefore global politics only increased with J.D. Vance becoming vice president, given that Vance is a friend of many of the post-liberals and has called himself a member of the post-liberal right, and so on. So yeah, I do think post-liberalism is a particular discrete strand within the new right, and a very interesting one at that. So the way I define it, and this is contentious in a sense. There's another book by a friend of mine called Paul Kelly that came out about the same time on post-liberalism. He cast the net much wider, so it does include national conservatives and populists and so on. But I actually have a much narrower focus, and think that post-liberalism is really defined by two things. And one is a complete wholesale rejection of liberalism, where liberalism is understood as primarily a philosophy, and a philosophy which they think centers the maximization of individual freedom, right? And they reject that wholesale, not particular versions or variants of liberalism. So they don't want to say, I mean, there's another person who's used the term post-liberal before, John Gray. I don't know if any of you know about him. He's a British academic. He's called himself post-liberal. He says he rejects liberalism, but what he actually just means is he rejects what he calls hyper-liberalism or progressive liberalism, and he defends a different sort of liberalism, right? So there are plenty of thinkers who will criticize neoliberalism or something like that, or more identity politics variants of liberalism, and then sort of defend some alternative liberalism in its place. But the post-liberals want to reject liberalism completely, right? So that, and I think that's actually common amongst the new right, pretty much, I should say. But nevertheless, that is one of their defining features. The second defining characteristic, I think, you've already touched on, Adam, is the character of it, the alternative politics they want to put in the place of liberalism, which is a politics that's very much geared towards this notion of the common good, where the common good takes its place of individual freedom at the center of the post-liberal alternative vision. And there are sort of four features of that, I think, worth highlighting as well. First of all, it's a perfectionist sort of politics. So they see that the role of politics is to guide people towards living the good life, or providing the conditions for human flourishing. So the common good is the highest good for individuals. It's a confessional politics, in the sense that they think the state should officially recognize the truth of Christianity, and probably in particular Catholicism. That Catholic strand is very, very important. It's fundamental, really, to understanding American post-liberalism, and it's that commitment to Christianity. If you're going to ask the question, well, what is the content of the common good? Well, it's the Catholicism, the Christianity, which really fills that out. Thirdly, it's a very statist politics, unlike other forms of the right, maybe like McIntyre, who was mentioned earlier. This is a politics that wants to seize power, wants to capture the state and use the state to realize post-liberal conservative ends. It's highly statist in that sense. This isn't small state conservatism or small government conservatism. This is big state politics that the post-liberals are involved in. And fourthly, they're elitists. It's an elitist politics they're advocating. Although they share much of the diagnosis of contemporary politics with many populists. So in Why Liberalism Failed, which again was mentioned earlier, Deneen talks through the various different reasons why they think liberalism has failed, and many of them are, pretty familiar now from the populist right, an out-of-touch elites imposing alien sort of liberal values on a true people who don't share those values, those sorts of thoughts. But whereas populists, in a sense, want to get rid of the people elites distinction, post-liberals think elites are completely inevitable in politics. You're not going to get away with them. The question is, how do you get the right elites into power, right? The elites who have the right values, i.e. Other post-liberals. Now, they differ amongst themselves about the strategy for that, and that might be something we can discuss. Deneen and Vermeule, in particular, disagree about that. But nevertheless, they're both committed to the idea of a very elitist, mostly top-down politics as well.
Okay, thank you. And I think we can return later on to all of the subtle ways in which Deneen and Vermeule are different from each other. But could you talk about why you focused on this strain of post-liberal, or this strain of the new right as opposed to others?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, my interests actually started very much in a British context. So British politics are, as you may be aware, quite out of sync. We're forever playing catch up with especially America, but parts of Europe as well. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, it became clear to me, as it became clear to absolutely everybody, that the Conservative Party at the time was an absolute shambles, absolute mess, and was heading towards a historic defeat at our next general election, which they indeed did receive in 2024. And what I was interested in the sense was the question of rethinking the ideological, intellectual foundations of conservative thought, thinking that the Conservative Party, in this country at least, would have the opportunity in opposition to sit and rethink its position. They've not turned out to, they've got no inclination to do that, it turns out. But nevertheless, that was what prompted my interest in the new right broadly, and then post-liberalism in particular, in a certain sense, because I'm a political theorist, and most of the post-liberals are also professional political theorists. So they are writing political theory. It lends itself to my toolkits such that it is. So I became very interested in them, but also, I remember having colleagues saying to me at the start, about 3 or 4 years ago, "Why are you wasting your time with these post-liberals? These are just a bunch of, it's just the online tappings of some eccentric, over-read, tenured professors." And then within a year or so, Vance is on the ticket with Trump and so on, and we're only now one over strenuous golf swing or one Big Mac away from having a post-liberal in the White House. So as it became clear that post-liberalism really was entering, or had a very good chance of entering, the corridors of power, that sort of, in a sense, gave me a sort of ex-post justification, extra justification for my interest. I should say that there are British post-liberals, and in a certain sense, they are the original post-liberals. So John Milbank, in particular, who's a theologian at Nottingham University, but then people like Adrian Pabst and Philip Blond, I don't know if any of these names resonate. But interestingly, their influence has been much more on the left, broadly speaking, and their ideas have very much influenced what's called Blue Labour over in the UK, which is a sort of very much a sort of centrist version of Labour politics. So they're much more the left, whereas the Americans are of the right. The Americans tend to be Catholic, whereas the British tend to be more Anglican and Orthodox. And I don't think there is actually much of a way of, despite sharing the same name, I think actually they are quite different thinkers. So in the end, having tried my best to sort of talk about post-liberalism in a broad sense that includes them both, I actually don't think that's plausible. And so, because I thought the politics of the American post-liberals was more radical, having more influence at the time, that's what really justified my interest and my focus. And I really do focus mainly on Adrian Vermeule and Patrick Deneen, because I think they are, in many ways, the most interesting, but more so the most influential of the post-liberals. And I certainly, my sense is that they're also something like as close as public intellectuals as we might have these days.
Okay. I'll open it up in just a second. So my last question, just in terms of establishing themes and definitions, is so I asked you what is post-liberalism, and I'd also like to ask what is liberalism. So you in the book you reject the characterization of liberalism offered by people like Patrick Deneen. It might be helpful just to flag very briefly why you reject that. And I'm not sure exactly if you offer an alternative. So it to just to what extent you think that liberalism admits of a definition, if you could speak to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's not very difficult. You don't need to be a professional political theorist, I don't think, to know that the definition that they use, the post-liberals use of liberalism, is deeply unfair. It's a caricature, it's a straw man, it's cherry picking. As I said before, I mean, for them, it's liberalism is a philosophy dedicated towards maximizing individual freedom, right? And it comes with it, therefore, that sort of a corollary set of ideas. They think that all liberals must be committed, therefore, to the idea of a social contract. The political authority comes via a social contract. An atomistic view of the individual, that individuals have rights and not duties, and so on, right? And the problem with this understanding of liberalism is just, quite frankly, there is no liberal in the history of liberalism who's held all of these views. And indeed, they'll say things like, well, John Locke, he believed in maximizing human freedom. Well, he absolutely did not think that. He could not have been clearer in the state of nature. That's a state of that he thought sort of complete freedom wasn't freedom. It was what he called license. It was a freedom of animals. It wasn't a freedom worth having. I mean, interestingly, then they never talk about. So sorry, just finish off that thought with John Locke. Of course, the idea is that freedom is actually acting in accordance with the will of God, with the law of nature, which is a very post-liberal thought. They'd be quite amenable to that in a sense. They don't talk about Immanuel Kant at all, interestingly, but nevertheless, he's obviously clearly very influential in terms of contemporary liberal political theory. And again, the idea there is not at all to maximize individual freedom. They should be free from all shackles, all impediments to their will, and so on. Freedom is acting in accordance with reason, which is the categorical imperative, right? So it's a ridiculous view of liberalism. I mean, of course, there are liberals who've held different parts of those. Of course, there have been liberals who are social contract theorists, but all equally, in fact, there have been many more liberals who completely reject the idea of the social contract. So on and so forth. So, that's really, it's a low-hanging fruit in terms of critiquing post-liberalism. I should, maybe we can come back to this. I also don't think it's particularly effective criticism for liberals to throw at post-liberals either, actually. But nevertheless, but then as I said, your other question is, well, what is liberalism in that sense? And I'm very reluctant to give a definition because I think it's a living historical tradition. I think to tie it down to a set of beliefs, it's just all instantly going to be open yourself up to being disproved by different historical accounts. I mean, I think people like Helena Rosenblatt, for example, has done a fantastic job in the short history of liberalism at showing just how diverse a set of beliefs liberals have had. So I'm not really, I don't really necessarily think it's important to tie down, at least not in the critique of post-liberalism, to tie down what liberalism means in its place. But I'm darn sure it doesn't mean what they think it means. And would challenge them to find any liberal who has ever believed what they think what they think liberalism is.
Yeah, I was really struck in the book. You observe that for Hobbes, the state of maximal freedom is the state of nature, and that's where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, at least in the social contract tradition, the state of total freedom or maximal freedom is something to run away from.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, they think Hobbes is the first liberal. They say that many times, but which I think is a ridiculous thought. But yeah, absolutely. State of nature is total freedom. We need to get away from that.
Okay, so I have more questions I can ask, but I'll open it up to everyone. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Chien, I don't know if you have. Oh no. Okay. Well,
Maybe not quite
Victoria,
yet.
go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll have a quick go. So in Cass Sunstein's book, he starts out with a manifesto of what he thinks liberalism is, which is a very interesting way to start, considering what you just said, which is there isn't a nice packaged definition. So he just rattles off all the things. But one of the things he says and is very firm about is pluralism, which to me, by definition, creates groups. So it isn't just one man against the world or one woman, you know. An admission of pluralism means that everybody's bundled up into little groups and operates in that fashion as well. So that's just a comment.
No, I haven't read Sunstein's book yet. I read some reviews, I should say, and the reviews weren't, at least the reviews I read weren't too favorable. One thing, am I right in saying that in his list is like 30 items long or something like that? It's a very long list. Yeah. I mean, again, that makes me worry that there aren't probably going to be many liberals who actually believed all 30 things. But you're right in a certain sense that that pluralism is always going to feature in a liberal worldview. I guess they're almost always going to share a background view of what society is, which is characterized by disagreement and conflict. Disagreement of values, moral values, and disagreement of interests, and so on. But the important question then is, well, what do you do about that? How do we live together despite that disagreement and conflict? In a certain sense, and this is how I sometimes teach liberalism, that's the very question of at the heart of liberalism. They all have and they have sort of different answers to that. But some of those answers can be more tolerant than others. There are some answers to that which will say, well, there is a liberal way of living, and that's the right way of living, and we need to therefore be perfectionist in this and help people live a good liberal life. That's how we respond best to disagreement and conflict. And there are others who take a much more tolerant live and let live sort of approach as well. So while I think it is right, I mean, in a certain sense, anyone would be silly not to have that background sociological view of that background view of society as characterized by disagreement and conflict. Post-liberals do sometimes think that. I think the interesting thing for liberalism, though, is how do you respond to that? And they do disagree quite a lot about how you respond to that.
Right, exactly. That tension between the group and the individual is an ongoing, and some people even have phrased that as competitive pluralism, that once it's grouped, you're competing for the good life. You're competing for, attracting people to fulfill human flourishing, if you want to be very broad about the topic. But yeah, thanks for the response.
No, thanks for the question.
Adrian, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. I have I'd be interested in Matt's view on why these collection of views, which aren't in themselves terribly new. I mean, they're re-articulations of misgivings people have had about liberalism in one way or another for a while. Um, why they decide to term themselves and why they are termed post-liberalism. So I'm thinking of, I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Holmes' book, I think in the early 90s, The Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism. And I think he's got an article in Liberalism and the Moral Life where he talks about the permanent structure of anti-liberalism. And so you have these same debates that have been going on in political theory for a couple of generations now, where the term is anti-liberalism, right? And even poor old Alistair McIntyre gets stuffed up a bit by Stephen Holmes as an anti-liberal. And so I wonder what it is that leads to these things being called post-liberal. So that's obviously I'm asking a question on online salon, so it's really just a mask for my own views. So I'll give my answer to it, but I am very interested in yours. I think probably what's going on is I think they scent blood. I think there's a sense, and this is where when I mentioned originally, I was sort of interested in the connection between these two genres of literature we have at the moment. So we have things like the Patrick Deneen and the Sarah Mari and Vermeule, and then the Brits. But then you also have books like Sunstein's and Fukuyama's and lots of other. There's this whole genre, kind of a crisis liberalism, which as you I think you noticed in Sunstein's, but the notion of liberalism at play there is not terribly crisp in purely politically theoretical terms. The historicism of it is a bit off, but I think probably what's going on with the post-liberals is they've spotted that liberalism is in crisis, and so these same objections, with which people interested in political theory will have been familiar for a while, now feel like they can be asserted with some force and perhaps with a new historical context. But I'm much more interested in your views.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, yes, I agree with everything you said, actually. I mean, many of the criticisms they make of liberalism, that undermines family, it's individualistic and undermines authority. I mean, these started appearing as soon as liberalism appeared on the stage. So these are 200-plus-year-old criticisms, and they've appeared regularly, frequently in cycles in the 200 years since then. So there is very little new about them in that sense. I think there are two reasons why they've chosen post-liberalism. One, I think, is precisely what you've said. And I'd go further, I think, and say it's really important, and a mistake that liberals are making in how they respond to post-liberals, that they don't treat them as a political movement, that they treat them as academics, as philosophers, and therefore they respond as academics do and philosophers do, applying all the tools of our trade to analysing the argument, finding the inconsistencies, so on and so forth, and think that's job done. So earlier I said that I think it's a mistake for liberals to point out that post-liberals get liberalism wrong and think that's, be very satisfied with themselves and think, job done. But it doesn't get you very far politically, and they don't care particularly that they've got liberalism wrong, because they're not doing academic philosophy in why liberalism failed, or regime change, or common good constitutionalism and these other things. They're not doing that sort of thing. It's political. And so therefore it's about trying to persuade people, trying to convince people, trying to package things in certain ways that it's more likely to convince people, and so on. So yes, I think the choice of post-liberalism is a marketing choice in that sense. It's better than anti-liberalism. It gives the sense, at least, of something like a positive, or more of a sense of it being a positive alternative to liberalism, not just anti-liberalism. So I think that's absolutely right. The other thing I would say, just in terms of the genealogy of the ideas, post-liberalism was actually originally a theological label. I think it was started in Yale in the 80s and then migrated over to the UK, but then was then taken up, as I said, with people like John Milbank and so on in the 90s and from then on. and then migrated back to the US. So I think there is also a sort of genealogy of ideas there as well. But I think the primary reason is precisely the one you put your finger on. So I've not said anything different there, other than I agree with you.
Gian?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Adrian that a lot of these criticisms aren't new. But might the post-liberal defender perhaps say, well, what has been new is that there's been we have kind of some data to back up our thesis, right? In the way that like communities have been eroded, traditional mores have been eroded, hyper-individualism is running amok in some ways. We have depths of despair, right? In a very kind of concrete way that we measure atomization, right? So I wonder how you might respond to that.
Well, two things, I think. I mean, again, these criticisms have come in cycles over the last 200 years, and at the same, when they have come to the fore, they've made the same sort of claims. Look around, we live in a world of irreligion and sin and so on and so forth, and that's liberalism's fault. So they've always claimed empirical basis for their anti-liberalism. But I think the other thing I would say is that it's just completely implausible to think that and this is the post-liberal claim in why liberalism fails, for example, that every social ill that we currently suffer, environmental, social, political, economic, they think is to be blamed solely, exclusively on the idea of this liberal commitment to maximizing individual freedom, playing itself out over 300 years. There's been nothing else that sort of played any causal role in deaths of despair, for example. No, it's completely liberalism's fault, where liberalism is understood in that quite specific way. Just as a sort of both as a historical account, but also just sort of sociological explanation. These problems we are suffering from are deeply complex, multifaceted. It's ridiculous, laughable almost, to think they are all caused by a single philosophical commitment. And that's the other thing about post-liberals. Many on the new right actually have the same idea. It's very much an ideas first sort of account. Ideas do everything. They're the only really engines of history. Everything is a consequence of ideas. You don't have to be a sort of full-blown materialist to think that there might be other factors that play a role in politics and so on. So yeah, I just think it's deeply implausible. Now, where I think if the post-liberals had said something like, hey, there's this idea out there, and not ascribe it to anybody, but look, there is this idea out there that human beings flourish best when all the obstacles to their will are removed, and that sort of freedom has been very important in justifying many policies over the last 40, 50, sort of post-World War II, maybe. That idea has had a really important effect, that there should be no limits to the human will. That's had all sorts of effects, and some have been absolutely catastrophic. Now, and don't assign that to liberalism, and don't say it's the only cause, or even the main cause of many of our problems. And I think most liberals will get on board with that. I think it'll be a perfectly viable, plausible thing to say. I would agree with them if they said that, something like that. There shouldn't be limits. Virtue, that sort of, I guess I'd push back with that pretty conservative idea that virtue does require human limits or something like that. If they said that, I would be on board. But that really isn't what they say.
Yes.
On that, I wanted to understand better the relationship between economics and post-liberalism. That ties it with Chen Yu's question about the causal factors underneath deaths of despair or other ailments of our current time, that might have little to do with, as you say, ideas, or not those ideas anyway, or set of ideas.
Yes. So, well, they have a very standard, I guess, or critique of neoliberalism, which they say, well, that's all called classical liberalism or neoliberalism. They'll say, well, this is purely this idea of maximizing individual freedom playing out in the economic sphere, right? The individual must have complete freedom of contract. There must be, proper protections of private property, and so on. Like the state must not have any role, must not interfere at all. The individual must be completely free, and then you get a sort of so the sort of Hayekian liberal. They often will think, well, that's what all liberals think again, and they, in a way, that resonates maybe more of the left, but it is there on the right sometimes. They think that sort of economics, that neoliberalism, hyper globalization bears responsibility for gutting local communities, right? So for offshoring of jobs, for whole industries shutting down, and so forth. And that when you get, cities that have got no jobs for young people, no hope, and so on, well, then it's no surprise that young people will start turning to drugs and so on, because there's no hope. There's a hopeless position for them to be in, and so therefore they turn to drugs, and also that there's no, because communities being hollowed away as well. They think, again, because what they think is the atomization of liberalism and so on. There are none of the traditional sort of support structures of family, of community, and those things to keep to guide young people towards making better decisions. So they think the state has effectively absconded responsibility for helping people make the right decisions, and therefore you shouldn't be surprised in conditions of economic despair that they go around making very, very bad decisions. So that's sorry, go on.
So I understand that this is kind of the standard critique of certain strains of conservatism towards liberal economics. But what is it that they're proposing in its stead?
Yes.
Specifically the post-liberals that you narrowed down.
Yeah. No, that's right. It's vague. They are, very interestingly, actually, they do think that conservatives like Reagan, Thatcher in this country don't deserve to be called conservatives. They have there's a special circle in hell, they think, for these conservatives who call themselves conservatives but really were just liberals. But they are vague. They don't have much in the way of sort of positive policies in its place. They'll say vague things. They'll say some things like there should be like local banks, right? So there should be banks for local areas who can invest and so on. We shouldn't be leaving it up just to major banks, but and they're committed, like many are these days, to reindustrialization, protecting the manufacturing base, restoring supply chains and any industries necessary for national security and so on, right? So I'll say things like that. But I guess the headline for the post-liberals is precisely that they think the state should be intervening in the economic sphere, because they think that actors in the economic sphere, powerful actors in the economic sphere, do not act towards a common good. And the state is the only entity with the power to counter those sorts of economic forces, and to guide the economy towards realizing the common good. Now, they might be very optimistic about that still,
Yes,
But
I
that's
find
very
this
much
very
their thing.
funny. I find this very funny because it's a critique that conservatives or post-liberals or anti-liberals come up with all the time, right? The relationship between government and market actors and oligarchs and monopolies, etc., etc. So it's quite murky as far as I can see it as an alternative.
Yes, no, it absolutely is. Um, I mean, I think this is, to be fair, I do think this is one, having said a minute ago that there's nothing new about post-liberalism. I do think that on the right, this is at least relatively new, that they are more left on economics. I don't think there have been many voices, at least in the last 40 or so years, who have advocated for a strong state acting in the market, intervening in the market. But yeah, I can't but agree with you that there's no detail here. In fact, if I had any interest in advising um, post-liberals as to what they need to do next, I would say they need a political economy. They need a model of political economy. In fact, I don't think it's just them who need that. I think many uh, Labour in this country could do with one, for example. But I do think that that's without that, no political project is viable, especially today. But it's gesturing, it's hand waving by the post liberals. As I should say, it is with everything they say. Actually, they'll say things about we need to be. I mean, one of my main criticisms of Patrick Deneen is that he never actually tells you any detail about what he proposes. So, for example, in regime change, he'll say something like that the worst separation that liberalism ever created was to separate church and state. And so you think to yourself, right, okay. So he's about to go and advocate that we need to reunite church and state, a bit like Adrian Vermeule says. But he never goes anywhere near saying that. And in fact, he doesn't even advocate there be an established church or anything relatively moderate like that, at least in your context. Sorry, America's context. He doesn't say anything. It's incredibly vague. And there's a wonderful interview with Ezra Klein, with Patrick Deneen. I do recommend you go and find it. Actually, it is really interesting because Ezra Klein, whatever his other faults, he's pretty relentless, and he really, really would not let Deneen go and said, "Look, no, tell me. You say you're pro-family. The state needs to be pro-family. So what precisely, in policy terms, do you want to happen then?" And all that he could admit, and this was a suggestion that Ezra Klein gave to him, was that people have to wait 2 years and have marriage counselling before they're compulsory marriage counselling before they're allowed to get divorced. Which, you may or may not support, but it's not a really very
Wait, so
radical.
the state pays for that counseling, presumably?
Yes, yeah. So even on the things that he's meant to be really passionate about, and is the front and center of his politics, in the end, he has no real different policy agenda. Nothing that's way off the mainstream. It's not as radical as it sounds.
Adrian and then Gian.
So of the three big American, the notable, the big names in post-liberalism, the only one whose book I've read is Patrick Deneen's, and from that I would agree that you could mount an objection to their views on the basis of their account of liberalism being not recognisable from the liberal canon. Although I think just one caveat there is that I think from what I can recall of the Deneen's book, it's less an account of liberalism as an interpretation of it. It's not quite saying this is what liberals say, as this is what they're really getting at. But I think I've heard them in conversation. I think Sohrab Ahmari, I've heard him say more interesting things in conversation, mount a more interesting post-liberal critique. I've not read his book, and one of the points I've heard him make, which is you wouldn't need him to make it, is that one of the ways liberalism has run into trouble, and this is one of the ways I think to go back to my other point that we might be these approaches or this criticism might interestingly to be called post-liberal, is that the core liberal idea of a sort of a proceduralist answer to the problem of pluralism, that looks like that's run into trouble. To go back to empirically, that looks shakier than it did. But also, perhaps a related development is that in any case, actually existing liberal regimes or administrations, we say, some big questions, they're not that procedural anyway. They've ended up becoming far more substantive as time's gone by. So you have these two quite considerable tensions in liberalism, which is that proceduralism feels like it doesn't work anymore, feels like it shows up in a number of problems, but also it's not really proceduralism. It's, perhaps a two-tier proceduralism, to take a phrase from British politics that Americans may not quite get. And I think that's I've heard him mount that objection in conversation, and that seems to me a more credible, a more salient point. Goes to the heart of liberalism than the stuff that I read in Deneen's book.
So Tyranny Inc., that's the book of both Sohrab Ahmari, you're probably referring to, which I think is actually a very good book, where he is I do think it's genuinely worth reading, where he really does attempt a pretty persuasive, I think, and effective criticism of unbridled capitalism, and he's pro unions and pro breaking up corporations and all those sorts of things. But there's more detail in there. I should say you're probably right. Ines, you were asking for that. I think if you're interested, Tyranny Inc. is probably the book you'll get most from. But what I would say is that Sohrab Ahmari is no longer a post-liberal, and he distanced himself pretty how would you put it? Pretty subtly but brutally last year at an essay in a journal called Liberties, where he basically said, if the Pope's not on board, then post-liberalism is a lost cause. So best of luck with that one, guys. I'm going to become a Christian Democrat. So he's now a pretty mainstream Christian Democrat now. But your broader point about the proceduralism, part of the trouble as well with the post-liberal definition of liberalism is they can't decide what it is they don't like about liberalism. On the one hand, they get very upset with the proceduralism and the claims to moral neutrality, right? So that sort of John Rawls like liberalism maybe, and they say, well, politics can never be neutral. It can never just be about procedure. It's always it not only always should be about promoting a particular vision of the good, it can't escape being promoting a particular vision of the good. So on the one hand, you've got that sort of attack on neutrality and proceduralism. But on the other hand, they'll say, well, the problem with liberalism, though, is they've got a very clear understanding of the good, of the human good. And that requires removing all obstacles to their will, maximizing human freedom, and so on. So they're perfectionist, to use the term from political theory. Liberalism isn't a neutral project; it's explicitly a perfectionist project. Hence, recent progressivism, identity politics, trans rights, and all those sorts of things. They'll say this is liberalism, actually existing liberalism, being very forceful in promoting a particular conception of the good. So yeah, on the one hand, they'll say liberals don't have a conception of the good, and that's the problem. But then they'll shift foot and go, no, the problem is they've got a vision of the good. It's just it's a wrong one. And that commitment to proceduralism, yeah, that's in lots of liberals. There's no doubt about that. But I think as a definition of actually existing liberalism, I think it's, especially with the more progressive liberalism in the last 10 years or so, I think they're, in a sense, probably right that other form of liberalism has been very effective. So I don't know if that actually answered your question.
It kind of hits on it. I guess if I can see some hands up, so just sneak in a very quick follow-up. I don't, and again, this would be to try and mount a better case than I've heard made from these figures. You could say, well, they're doing both. There's not really a contradiction, or rather, the contradiction is in the thing being critiqued, which is that what liberalism is doing is it's advancing the substantive positions by proceduralist means. So things like legal activism, technocracy, those sorts of things that you through the standard instruments of classical liberal proceduralism, what you're really doing is kind of sneaking in some quite radical changes to a society or areas that just a consensus and consent model wouldn't really achieve. And I think probably that's probably the critique, really, or rather that's a more interesting critique, that those two things, they are in contradiction with each other, but then what you're spotting is hypocrisy, not mere contradiction.
No, that's right. So I think on one hand they are accusing liberals of being hypocrites about this, but I think also there is also the sort of the claim that especially culturally, they've been blatant and explicit in wanting to push a certain view of the good. I mean, one other thing to say, I use the term actually existing liberalism in my book as well. I mean, and that's a term you used a moment ago. The other problem, though, with their whole the setup really is that, especially in our own country, it's just absurd to say that our country is purely liberal, as if there's no other tradition or set of ideas that have played any role in creating that ideological mishmash, which is almost every constitution and every way of politics going along. And that includes in our country some very sort of small c conservative views as well. So I think appealing to actually existing liberalism doesn't necessarily, and then saying, well, the US is actually existing liberalism or UK is. Empirically, I think that's a very dubious way of proving that what you're looking at is this thing called liberalism.
Gian?
Yeah, actually, Adrian and Matt addressed much of what I was going to ask initially, especially the invocation of the proceduralism. I was going to introduce another, not exactly post-liberal, but maybe a communitarian critic of liberalism, Michael Sandel, right? In his famous work, The Limits of Justice, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, he exactly kind of advances this point, right? Like it's not so much that liberals reject any comprehensive notions of the good, is that their claim to neutrality, that is a comprehensive notion of the good. That is a substantive agenda that is actually being imposed. So yeah, you guys covered that very well. But so I might shift the question and ask that, like, to this kind of flip-flopping that, Matt, you're referring to of the post-liberals, that they claim that the liberals are on one hand saying they have no comprehensive agenda, and on the other hand, saying that they do. Like, might the post-liberals rebut by saying that, well, this ambiguity around those two positions is precisely the inarticulacy that is engendered by like not being willing to hold on to a substantive version of the good, right? This is John Rawls, right? It's the priority of the right over the good, right? So I don't know. I could and I bring in Sandel because, like, he talks quite a bit about Kant, right? Like that might be a more nuanced theoretical criticism of liberalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think my own view is, I think liberalism took at least in academic circles, took something of a wrong turn. With that whole neutrality debate was a complete and utter wrong turn. I think Charles Larmor was much better than John Rawls insofar as he explicitly recognized the Kantian underpinnings. So a very specific moral philosophy that was underpinning that move to political liberalism in the 1990s. And that was also recognized by people like John Gray and so on. So I think I do share the skepticism about neutrality, that sort of neutrality liberalism. Absolutely, I do think that was a wrong turn. Um, the difficulty, in a sense, is I would find with that sort of response is that who are we talking about and what are we talking about? And if you're going to say, well, yes, there's lots of liberals who did believe in neutrality, especially in recent years, and then there are lots who are more perfectionists. That's true of the tradition, the intellectual tradition of liberalism. That's absolutely true. But what does that tell you about what I've just said we shouldn't talk about, but I'll use it anyway. What does that tell you about actually existing liberalism? Because post-liberals do seem to think there is just this very straightforward sort of liberals say X and Y happens in real life. So if you want to understand liberalism, you go to the thinkers. You want to understand why liberalism's failed, you go to the thinkers. So I'm not sure that focusing on the fact that liberal thinkers disagreed about this is very illuminating in that sense. What's more illuminating is thinking, I guess, what Adrian was saying a moment ago is, how has this move to proceduralism worked in practice? Has it been hiding a more substantive set of commitments and so on? I just don't think it matters, what liberal thinkers thought, and that they thought different things about this in that regard. I don't think that's the most important question.
I wonder if I might add just one interesting. I think it's quite right. Like the liberal tradition is quite varied over its own history, right? But might we be able to say that liberalism, as we understand it now, they do all tend to agree on a kind of secular worldview, right? Like almost no one holds on to like a Lockean or a conception of liberalism. I think, right? So might that be seen as a sort of like in the inevitable logic of liberalism that it must secularize and depart from its own tradition?
I mean, there are still, Catholic liberals. Any religious liberal believer is probably going to believe that liberal values are justified by their substantive moral views, and there are probably a good few million of them. These are precisely the people that post-liberals are really angry against. Those Catholics, those fusionists who have reconciled themselves to liberalism. They think, no, if you're a true Catholic, you'd realize that we'd be misinterpreting Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae, and all those sorts of things. And a true Catholic should reject pluralism. But nevertheless, these are people who find theological justifications for Christian for liberalism. And I don't know. Depends how you interpret things like human rights, I guess, as well, and whether how much you rely on things like natural rights and how far you think those are secular concepts and so on. So I'm not quite so sure. I think in academic circles, that's almost certainly going to be in the Rawlsian tradition. That's definitely right. But I think again, out there in the real world, I think that's very different.
Victoria?
Changing gears just a bit, but how do you feel then about Sunstein's sort of direction at Hayek's praxeology as a means of individuals under individual agency making selections for their common good and sort of in an invisible hand way coming together in different groups to fulfill that, and that being sort of a spontaneous and ever-changing dynamic for the human flourishing side of liberalism?
Well, again, without having read it, I find it hard to say anything substantive. I mean, there's a view about what I would think and a view about what post-liberals would think. And what post-liberals would think is that these things don't tend to work out too well, and unless humans are actually guided as to what's in their true interest by those who know better, then they're going to make bad choices and wrong choices. So they might gather together in groups, but their own choices don't have a particular sort of authority. Political authority doesn't come from people's choices. It comes from acting in accordance with the common good. So they're not going to be too, they're not, they think in a certain sense, at least Vermeule does, that pluralism is regrettable. It's a consequence of sin, essentially. Deneen is a bit different, but essentially, if people are choosing to live together in groups and they're choosing to live together along in the wrong ways, then that's something politics should be deeply concerned about. Now, my understanding of the Sunstein book, and if what you, I'm sure what you've said is a perfectly good retelling of what he says. A lot of reviews I've read have said that it's a really how would you put it? Really, it's not the sort of defensive liberalism that we need. It's too easy and just restating old principles. And that invisible hand argument, is well, it's older than liberalism itself, essentially. And no one's going to be won over by retelling that story. Probably isn't the sort of defensive liberalism that we need today. Not least, and the post-liberals think this, and I personally would tend to agree, that the invisible hand doesn't play out too well in the economic sphere if left without some sort of political intervention. And you don't have to couch that in terms of the common good or anything like that to think that way of leaving the market to itself and so on can have deleterious effects, social, political, environmental, and so on. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of my personal view, given you asked, is that invisible hand sort of arguments. I guess I would agree with post-liberals in this sense that I'm dubious that that's the sort of liberalism we need again today. 2008 crisis, so on and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, just to jump in to follow up, I mean, individual agency gives permission to allow state intervention. There's no anyone that I can imagine, liberal or not, that doesn't believe in the state and the state's ability to perform functions that provide order and increase individual agency, not detract from it. So I don't think there's any support for, the wild, that first image of the wild man and the nature sort of thing. It's always in conjunction with pluralism and with groupings of people in the state.
Well, again, the post-liberals reject the idea that political authority comes from individual choices. They don't give any credence to that view. Political authority comes from acting in accordance with the common good. And that's what legitimates intervening, they think, in groups or with individuals who make the wrong sort of choices. So that's one set of people. I actually think there are probably an awful lot of Catholics as well, and Christians who would think something similar. You don't have to be a full-blooded post-liberal, I think, to be skeptical about the power or the authority that's produced by individual choices. I suspect, and even that there've even been some liberals. There have been some liberals. Even someone like John Stuart Mill, the exemplar liberal in many ways, right? And his famous On Liberty. He's all about letting people make choices. But he still does think there are right choices and there are wrong choices. Higher and lower pleasures, as he called them, and so on. And he still had an optimism, which we don't now share, I would say, that the rational person would always make the right choice. Now, what he didn't think is the state should intervene to stop people from making the wrong choices. But nevertheless, he was deeply uncomfortable with people just going off and he didn't want the state to intervene, but he still wasn't completely comfortable with the idea of people going off and making wrong choices, right to do wrong in that sense.
So Jean-Bourg?
I was curious
how you would contrast the post-liberal liberal attitude towards local organizing or things like that, top down, bottom up in general, and maybe like even what's your personal view on that?
Yeah, well, so they're pro. They say they're very much pro-union. They want to strengthen local communities. They think that the atomization of society of individuals has undermined local communities, and so on. So they say they're very much in favor of helping local communities strengthen and flourish. Now they say that, but then on the other hand, they'll say something quite different. So I don't know how many of you know aware of this. I think it's got a funny story, so sorry, indulge me. But so Deneen publishes Why Liberalism Fails. It became a surprise bestseller. Obama put it on his summer reading list and so on. Adrian Vermeule reviews it in a piece called Integration from Within. And he says at the end, he says, this book is near genius. And the only thing that stops it, Vermeule thinks, from being genius is that at the end of Why Liberalism Fails, Deneen says, what should we do in the ruins of liberalism? How are we to continue to live a life of virtue? Well, he gives the McIntyre answer, which is we need to sort of retreat to local communities. And Vermeule says, well, that's the problem. That's what stops it from being absolute genius. Because no, it's not about strengthening local communities. What we need to do is actually seize the state. And then once we've seized the state, we can, use that overwhelming power of the state has to foster post-liberal virtues and ends and so on. And that's where you get this sort of elitism, top-down politics of post-liberalism. So on the one hand, they say in a very familiar conservative way, yes, this is all about empowering local communities, helping them flourish, and so on, with, I guess, the implication that sort of Victoria was mentioning a moment ago, that maybe people, choose to live together in different ways. They have the freedom to do that. But then, no, actually, the politics they have is a politics of the common good, which is going to impose in various ways a common good upon everybody. So it's another way in which they think, in which there's a sort of flip-flopping or inconsistency, I think, in their thinking. But ultimately, I think actually the what's most important about post-liberalism, most distinctive about it, is that top-down common good version. And they seem to think that everything will work out well, and so you'd have flourishing local communities, but really they lose interest in that. And they're much more interested in the politics and the top-down approach.
And just to follow up just a tiny bit, like kind of how does that contrast to the liberal stance, or like how you would understand the liberal stance compared to that?
Well, I mean, again, it depends what liberals you're speaking about. I mean, if you start someone like Chandran Kukarthas, the liberal archipelago, he has that sort of view of let people join whatever societies they want or little communities they want, and if they want to live according to Sharia law, then absolutely fine. If they want to practice female genital mutilation, absolutely fine. As long as there's a right to exit, he thinks the state should really have very little role to play whatsoever. You let these little islands of communities self-govern, self-regulate. And he's a liberal. But then you get other liberals, multicultural liberals maybe, who in a sense will say, yeah, we've got to recognize groups and sort of cultural difference and so on, but still there are certain things that within a liberal society they can't do, which might include FGM and living according to Sharia law and so on. So yeah, liberal theory just isn't. This goes back to what I was saying to Victoria, I guess, at the very beginning, which is that liberals just have different responses to this question of disagreement and conflict and difference and so on. that's my own view. Well, I guess I don't have a settled one, other than it's complicated.
I just put a link to the Kukatas book that Matt mentioned in the chat
Yeah,
if you're
thanks.
interested. Ines?
Apart from the fact that there isn't a political economy accompanying it, what do you see as post-liberalism's Achilles heel? Because now that I was just thinking about what you said about Sharia law, and we live in pluralistic societies now. There isn't even a majority group that can see itself continuing to be the majority for many decades from now on. So the archipelagization of society is not something that is inevitable, it's something that is an actuality. And therefore this over like top-down vision of the good seems bizarre as an option. Until demographics corrects itself, if it's gonna do that. But anyway, that's what I see, but perhaps you see something else.
No, I think it's a variant of what you just said, actually. I mean, so one of the differences between Patrick Deneen and Vermeule, one of the main differences, is that Patrick Deneen pretty ridiculously thinks that the vast majority of the people are calling out for post-liberal values. They want post-liberalism. They just got the wrong elite. And so when he talks about regime change, what he means is getting an elite in place who share the already existing values of the people. Now, that's obviously ridiculous, right? It's obviously ridiculous. I mean, even his fellow Catholics don't have the same views as he does around abortion, around more influence of religion in the public sphere, and so on. And I talk about some of the data about around that in the book. Now, Adrian Vermeule, to his credit, is realistic enough to know that the people they are not calling out for post-liberal values. They're not hankering for a post-liberal party to come along and then they'll vote for them. He thinks that we have been too corrupted by liberalism. So we have the wrong values. And so his post-liberalism is explicitly transformative. He thinks you should capture the state and use state power to change people's beliefs and values so that they then do want the right thing. And he says confidently, he's got no doubt whatsoever this will work. He says people will come to thank you, right? Now, what I don't think that he and many other post-liberals recognize just how much coercion is involved in such a project. Now, Kevin Valier had a book called All the Kingdoms of the World, in which he argues that Adrian Vermeule's society, in a sense, will become coercive and tyrannical, in a sense, in the transition from liberalism to post-liberalism. It's going to he doesn't intend it, but nevertheless, it's going to have to take a tyrannical, coercive route. My argument is no, it's intentional. He knows full well that this is going to be a violent, coercive, repressive, authoritarian system that has to clamp down on pluralism and disagreement. So if I would say what else is his Achilles heel, I think it's that it, at least in the form of Vermeule, I think it is explicitly, blatantly authoritarian, and scary for that reason.
I'll just intervene quickly. For Deneen, how explicit is he that he thinks these ideas of the common good are have popular support? Is that just a throwaway line, or does he make a lot out of this?
Yeah. No, it's central to his idea of what's he called, a hybrid constitution, or whatever he calls it, mixed constitution. It's that sort of old sort of classical idea that the people have a common knowledge. The people know, what's properly good. It's the elites who are out of touch and so on, and you need to get an elite who are sort of aligned to the common good of what people already know. So no, it's central. It's absolutely central.
I see. Adrian?
Yeah. So again, to try and reconstruct a better post-liberalism than the one on offer from the integralists, might a more interesting a due target of their critique not be the main liberal theorists, either of the canon or more recent academics, but it could be, and this is here I'm tub thumping a bit, but this genre of kind of crisis liberalism that we've seen probably really since sort of Trump Brexit, where you have people like Sunstein's book and Fukuyama's book, and I think Yasha Mounk's probably there's a you know, 2 or 3 a year. Mark Liller wrote one, right? In which I think, as you've probably noticed, the account of liberalism has some sort of theoretical and conceptual and historiographic problems, right? So, but that's liberalism, right? That might be actually existing liberal theory, and that could be a big problem. It couldn't just be that you've got a bunch of guys who are kind of quasi-journalists. No, they're journalists. That sort of that journalist, public intellectual, not quite academics, not quite philosophers, not quite theorists, but they'll have to do, right. That's the voice, that's the theoretical and the main discursive presence of liberalism in the public. So that's how it's showing up. And these people aren't inconsequential. Sunstein and Fukuyama certainly aren't. So that's liberalism doing its thinking aloud in our public and political culture. That's where it is. That might be what you want to critique. And I think perhaps also like the work of Michael Frieden is interesting here, because he's written many accounts for liberalism, but he's also one of the principal theorists of ideology, where he gives an account of what more is going on in the ideology than mere theory or ideas. And so if you were going to set about being a post-liberal in a more interesting, a more intellectually interesting way than the integralists, that might be what you might aim at. And in doing so, you might say, look, it's never mind Locke, never mind rules. This is how it's showing up. This is the intellectual culture of contemporary liberalism. This is how it's showing up in people who kind of have a voice in policy and politics and culture. And there you do find a bit more. They're not terribly coherent, but there you do find some slightly cruder ideas. There you do find jostling among this kind of basket of things, and it's a mess, and that's interesting itself. But there you do find some quite crude and monolithic formulations of what liberalism might try to be.
No, that's right. But I mean, what's interesting there is the overlap between those liberals and post-liberals. I mean, Mark Liller, Fukuyama, both published critiques of identity politics. I don't, maybe some other names I mean, Yasha Monk as well actually is pretty critical of it as well. So it's interesting that there'd actually be a bit of overlap there. And of course, the very thing that it really matters to post-liberals that there's no liberal alternative left standing. Every form of liberalism has to be discredited in order for their alternative to be the only one we can now turn to. So not a different strand of liberalism. So they think that essentially classical liberalism and identity progressive liberalism are essentially just variants of the same thing, and the economic liberalism, classical liberalism, will eventually become progressive liberalism, because there's a sort of logic of progress where liberalism is always looking for the next set of obstacles to tear down to the human will. So it might start with hierarchy, feudalism, and so on, aristocracy, but eventually it will get towards things like biology. So that's an interesting area of overlap. In a sense, they're both critical of that sort of politics, but I don't. So I think it matters that the post-liberals want to say everything's discredited. So as much as Fukuyama might say, well, I don't agree with that either, the sort of logic of his position will mean that that sort of politics will end up at progressive politics anyway. Otherwise, it leaves it open for people to say, okay, but what about these other strands of liberalism than the ones being espoused by Fukuyama and so on? And that's exactly what the post-liberals want to close down. Yeah.
So Jean-Bor in the chat asked about Rousseau and the idea of being forced to be free. And I was wondering if you just wanted to speak a little bit about perfectionist ideas in liberalism, maybe about Rousseau in particular, or about the specific strain that you talk about later in the book associated with Hobhouse and T.H. Green.
Yeah. So the last chapter of the book, or penultimate chapter of the book, is essentially to say, okay, well, look, maybe, and there are these people like Samuel Moyne, for example, who are saying, well, the thing is, post-liberalism needs to return to sort of perfectionist roots, that it needs to have a more muscular account of what it thinks the what human flourishing consists in, what the conditions for human flourishing are, and to better promote those. For in that sense, they are. I mean, people like T.H. Green and Hobhouse, maybe in particular, they are not a million miles away from Rousseau. They would never put it in this way. They weren't as flamboyant rhetorically as Rousseau, but there was a sense in which, yeah, you can be coerced in the name of your own freedom, and coercion against your will can make you more free. They did believe in the common good and so on, and this really isn't an uncommon view in the liberal tradition at all. But the reason why, but then I sort of say, well, how viable is that for us today? And it suffers from, in a sense, as many of the same problems as the post-liberal perfectionism does, and the sort of problems that we've been discussing about pluralism and coercion and so on. Yes, that in a sense that's where my next research project has taken me, is to look again at these liberal perfectionists and see if there is anything like an alternative liberal perfectionism that can be made compatible with pluralism, or whether that option's just no longer viable to us. That's where I'm going next, I think.
Well, we are at time. I don't know if anyone has any last minute quick questions for Matt.
Yeah, I do. I was wondering, I know you recommended 3 books, or I at least caught 3 books throughout the chat, the Tyranny Inc., Liberal Archipelago, and All the Kingdoms of the World. But do you know of anyone right now working on something closer to a political economy of post-liberalism, or anything closer to realpolitik, like where they'd like to see, MAGA go from here to kind of co-opt the movement, or maybe not co-opt the movement, maybe give it more backing, but anything like that? Or is it more just Deneen's general murkiness, as I'm going to steal Ness's term?
So try, if you're interested in the sort of political economy, another book you might be interested in is this guy's, I would call him a minor player in the post-liberal world, but nevertheless, he is a name. It's called The Collapse of Global Liberalism by Philip Pilkington. That might be where to, first place to go for, as well as Tyranny Inc., for some more political economy. And your other question was really about the future of MAGA, and one book this isn't necessarily about the future of MAGA, but it's a very good account of where many of the ideas have come from of the new right. There's a book called Furious Minds, by someone called Laura Fields, which is a very, very readable book, and does give a good account of the sort of the different post-liberalism amongst them, but the various different strands of the new right and the key figures in there. So including Steve Miller and Harvey Mansfield and Vance and people like that. So it's not necessarily about the future as such, but it is about what the sort of that heady ideological brew that is Margot and the different strands of them, and and so therefore does give a sense of what the various options might be going forward.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Yes, please.
Sure. If I can ask a very quick question now that we're on recommendations. Have any philosophers integrated AI into their political philosophy that you would recommend? Say liberalism, illiberalism, something else like communism.
I don't know the answer to that. Sorry, it's sort of outside my area. I mean, I'm sure there will be. It's the latest bandwagon, so I'm sure there will be, but no, I'm sorry, that's none that I'm aware of.
If you follow Kevin Vallier on social media, so he wrote
Yes.
the book on all the kingdoms of the world. He has not integrated AI into political philosophy, but he's very much interested in the development of the technology. So a lot of his tweeting is about new tools that are being rolled out.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's right. Another one would be a guy called at Oxford called, oh no, he just left, but John Tassoulias, I think he's Greek. But there was a ethics of AI institute set up at Oxford, and he was the director of that, and so was interested in a legal background as well. So he was interested in how AI might affect more jurisprudence, I guess.
Another name is Seth Lazar,
Yes.
who I think he's published
Yeah.
a few political philosophy papers on the relevance of AI.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining us to talk about this stuff on Sunday. So the book, Post-Liberalism, should be available if you're in the US to order tomorrow or maybe in a couple of weeks from Amazon. Yeah, so thank you. And Matt, thanks for
No,
spending your
thank you
time with
both.
us.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was
Okay.
so interesting.
Thank you.
All right, take care.